Think your job is rough. Think dealing with difficult customers, long hours, or workplace politics is the worst thing that could happen to your career. Well, buckle up, because I'm about to take you on a journey through 7 medieval professions that were so revolting, so absolutely nauseating, that they would make your worst Monday morning look like a spa vacation. These weren't just dirty jobs. These were careers that required people to wade through human waste, handle rotting corpses, and perform tasks so disgusting that even medieval people, who lived in an era where bathing was considered suspicious and medicine involved drinking mercury, thought these occupations were absolutely vile. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what it meant to work the most repulsive jobs in medieval society. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll be kissing the ground your modern office building stands on. And if you're ready to dive into the absolute worst that medieval employment had to offer, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because we've got plenty more historical nightmares that will make you grateful for labor laws and workplace safety regulations. Let's start with a job that literally stunk up entire city blocks. Let me introduce you to what was arguably the most disgusting profession in human history, the gong farmer. And before you get any romantic ideas about farming, these people weren't growing crops. They were farming something much worse, human excrement. Medieval cities had a serious problem. Thousands of people living in close quarters, all producing waste, with no modern sewage systems to handle it. The solution was public latrines built over deep pits, and when these pits filled up, someone had to empty them. That someone was the gong farmer. Picture this as your daily routine. You arrive at work in the dead of night. Because this job was so revolting, it could only be done when most people were asleep and wouldn't have to witness the horror. You're equipped with nothing but buckets, shovels, and maybe a cloth over your face that does absolutely nothing to block the overwhelming stench. You climb down into pits that are sometimes 20 feet deep, filled with months or even years' worth of human waste, urine, rotting food scraps, and dead rats. The smell is so overpowering that it can knock you unconscious, which actually happened regularly, leading to gong farmers suffocating to death in pits of excrement. But here's where it gets worse. Gong farmers didn't just shovel this waste into carts and dump it outside the city. They had to sort through it, because valuable items, coins, jewelry, anything metal, often ended up in the latrines. So part of your job description included fishing through human feces with your bare hands, searching for anything worth salvaging. The health consequences were exactly what you'd expect. Gong farmers had life expectancies that were dramatically shorter than even other medieval laborers. They suffered from constant dysentery, parasitic infections, skin diseases, and respiratory problems from inhaling toxic gases. Many went blind from the ammonia fumes, and most developed what medieval physicians called gong farmer's cough, a chronic respiratory condition that usually proved fatal. And here's the kicker. Because this job was so essential and so revolting, gong farmers were paid relatively well by medieval standards, but they were also social outcasts. They were required to live outside city walls, couldn't enter taverns or churches while working, and were generally treated as if they carried the plague, which, given their working conditions, they often did. Medieval medicine was a nightmare of superstition and primitive treatments, but one of the most popular cures for everything from headaches to heart problems was bloodletting using leeches, and someone had to collect those leeches. Welcome to one of the most revolting jobs in medical history. Leech collectors, also known as leech gatherers, spent their days wading through swamps, marshes, and stagnant ponds, searching for the parasitic worms that medieval physicians believed could cure any ailment. But this wasn't just a matter of picking leeches off lily pads. The most effective method for collecting leeches was to use yourself as bait. Leech collectors would wade into infested waters and allow hundreds of leeches to attach to their legs and arms. They'd stand there for hours while the creatures latched onto their skin, sucking their blood, until they were covered from ankle to thigh with writhing, blood-gorged parasites. Then came the removal process, which was often more dangerous than the collection itself. Pulling leeches off incorrectly could leave their teeth embedded in your flesh, causing infections that could turn gangrenous. The collectors developed techniques for removal, but even experts regularly suffered from severe blood loss, anemia, and infected wounds. But the real nightmare was what lived in those stagnant waters alongside the leeches. Medieval swamps were breeding grounds for every disease you can imagine. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid, and parasites that made leeches look friendly by comparison. Collectors regularly contracted diseases from contaminated water entering open wounds, and many suffered from chronic illnesses that slowly consumed their bodies over years. The psychological toll was equally brutal. Imagine going to work every day, knowing that your job involves letting hundreds of parasites feed on your blood while you stand in water filled with human waste, dead animals, and disease. Many leech collectors developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, and some became so obsessed with blood-sucking creatures that they'd hallucinate leeches crawling on their skin even when they weren't working. Now we move from the physically disgusting to the spiritually horrifying, the sin eater. This was a profession that combined the worst aspects of social ostracism with a job description that literally involved consuming the sins of dead people. When someone died in medieval communities, especially if they'd lived a particularly sinful life, families would hire a sin eater to perform a ritual that would supposedly cleanse the deceased soul and prevent them from haunting the living. The process was as revolting as it sounds. The sin eater would arrive at the house where the corpse lay, usually someone who was already a social outcast, because taking this job meant you could never fully reintegrate into normal society. They would place bread and salt on the chest of the corpse, sometimes directly touching the deceased's skin, and then eat the food while reciting prayers or incantations. But here's what made this job particularly nightmarish. The belief was that by eating food that had touched the corpse, the sin eater was literally absorbing all of the dead person's sins into their own soul. They were trading their spiritual salvation for money, knowingly damning themselves so that others could achieve paradise. The bread and salt often became contaminated with bodily fluids from the decomposing corpse. Medieval bodies weren't embalmed like modern corpses. They were often bloated, leaking, and crawling with maggots by the time the sin eater arrived. So not only were you eating food contaminated with death, you were doing it while surrounded by the overwhelming stench of human decomposition. Sin eaters lived as complete social outcasts. They couldn't attend church services, couldn't marry within the community, couldn't touch other people's food or belongings. They lived alone, often in huts outside town boundaries, and when they died, they were buried in unmarked graves in unconsecrated ground because they were believed to carry the accumulated sins of everyone whose spiritual burdens they had consumed. The psychological impact was devastating. Many sin eaters developed severe depression and anxiety, constantly tormented by the belief that they were carrying the spiritual corruption of dozens or hundreds of dead people. Some became obsessed with finding ways to purge the accumulated sins, leading to extreme self-punishment rituals that often proved fatal. If you think modern laundry is tedious, wait until you hear about the medieval fuller, the person responsible for cleaning cloth and clothing in an era before soap, washing machines, or any understanding of hygiene. This job combined toxic chemicals, human waste, and working conditions that would make a modern sweatshop look like a luxury spa. Fullers were responsible for treating newly woven cloth to make it dense, clean, and wearable. But the process they used was so revolting that it defied human comprehension. The primary cleaning agent wasn't soap. It was fermented human urine, collected from public latrines, and aged until it reached peak ammonia concentration. Picture your typical workday as a fuller. You arrive at a workshop filled with massive vats of stale urine, so concentrated that the ammonia fumes would burn your eyes and throat from across the room. You'd spend your day standing ankle-deep in this liquid, stamping on cloth with your bare feet to work the urine into the fibers. But urine wasn't the only disgusting ingredient in medieval cloth treatment. Fullers also used something called fuller's earth, clay mixed with animal fat, rotting fish, and sometimes human feces. They'd knead this mixture into fabric by hand, working it deep into the fibers until their hands were permanently stained and cracked from the caustic chemicals. The health consequences were immediate and severe. Fullers developed what was known as fuller's rash, severe chemical burns on their hands and feet that often became infected. The constant exposure to ammonia fumes caused respiratory problems that made breathing painful and eventually led to chronic lung diseases. And if you're finding this exploration of medieval workplace horror as fascinating as I did when I first discovered these historical nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We've got so many more stories about the brutal realities of life before modern labor protections. But the worst part of being a fuller wasn't the chemical exposure, it was the social stigma. Because fullers worked with urine and feces daily, They were considered permanently contaminated. They couldn't prepare food for others, couldn't enter churches without special purification rituals, and were generally treated as walking sources of disease, which they often were. When horses, cattle, or other large animals died in medieval times, someone had to deal with the carcasses. That someone was the knacker, and this job involved everything that could possibly go wrong when dealing with rotting animal flesh. Knackers were responsible for butchering dead animals to salvage anything useful, meat that was still edible, bones that could be ground into meal, hides that could be turned into leather, and fat that could be rendered into tallow for candles. But these weren't animals that had been slaughtered fresh. These were creatures that had died of disease, old age, or accidents, and had often been decomposing for days before the knacker arrived. Imagine showing up to work and finding a horse that's been dead for a week in summer heat. The carcass is bloated with decomposition gases, the skin is slipping off in sheets, and the smell is so overwhelming that it can be detected from miles away. Maggots have turned the interior into a writhing mass of white larvae, and every cut you make releases new waves of putrid gas that can literally knock you unconscious. But you still have to butcher this carcass because every part has economic value. You're working with primitive knives, cutting through diseased tissue, dodging sprays of contaminated bodily fluids, and trying to salvage usable materials from an animal that's more decomposition than flesh. The health risks were extraordinary. Knackers regularly contracted anthrax, glanders, and dozens of other diseases that jumped from animals to humans. They suffered from constant infections from cuts made by contaminated tools, respiratory problems from inhaling decomposition gases, and skin conditions from handling diseased animal hides. Socially, knackers were treated almost as badly as executioners. They lived outside town boundaries, were prohibited from selling their salvaged meat in regular markets, and were generally considered sources of disease and spiritual contamination. Many communities required knackers to wear special clothing or carry bells to warn others of their approach. During plague outbreaks, someone had to help the plague doctors, those iconic figures in bird-like masks who attempted to treat the dying. That assistant job was one of the most dangerous and revolting positions in medieval society. While the plague doctor at least had some protective equipment, the famous beak mask filled with herbs, leather gloves, and a long coat, assistants usually worked with minimal protection, handling the most contaminated materials and performing the tasks that were too dangerous even for the protected doctor. Your daily routine involved entering homes where entire families had died of plague, removing corpses that had been decomposing for days, and cleaning up the horrific mess that plague victims left behind. Plague causes victims to vomit blood, suffer explosive diarrhea, and develop massive pus-filled buboes that burst and leak infected fluid. Someone had to clean all of that up, but the worst part was handling the corpses. Plague victims often died in agony, their bodies contorted and covered in the distinctive black spots that gave the Black Death its name. As an assistant, you'd have to straighten these bodies, wrap them in shrouds, and transport them to mass graves, all while knowing that every breath you took, every surface you touched, could be carrying the disease that had already killed a third of Europe's population. The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical danger. Assistants watched entire communities die, saw children orphaned and left to starve, and witnessed suffering on a scale that broke many people's minds. Most assistants didn't last more than a few weeks before either dying of plague themselves or abandoning the job to flee to unaffected areas. Job number 7, the executioner's helper. And finally, we reach what might be the most psychologically devastating job in medieval society, assisting the public executioner. While the executioner himself was usually skilled at quick, efficient kills, the helper had to deal with all the preparation, cleanup, and disposal that made public executions possible. Before each execution, you'd be responsible for preparing the victim, stripping them, tying them to the execution device, and sometimes performing preliminary tortures designed to extract confessions. You'd have to look into the eyes of people who knew they were about to die and participate in the process of ending their lives. During the execution, your job was to manage the crowd, clean up blood, and deal with the inevitable mishaps that occurred when killing people with primitive tools. Medieval executions were rarely quick or clean. Axes got stuck in bone, ropes broke during hangings, and victims often took minutes to die while you had to maintain order among crowds who were there for entertainment. After the execution, the real nightmare began. You had to dispose of the body, clean the execution site, and maintain the equipment. This meant scraping dried blood off axes, repairing gallows stained with bodily fluids, and sometimes dismembering corpses for display as warnings to other potential criminals. The social isolation was complete. Executioners' helpers lived as complete outcasts, unable to marry into respectable families, barred from most social institutions, and treated as if death itself clung to them. Many developed severe psychological problems from the constant exposure to violence and death, and alcoholism was nearly universal among people in this profession. The brutal reality. So there you have it. 7 medieval jobs that would make your worst employment nightmare look like a dream vacation. These weren't just difficult jobs. They were occupations that required people to sacrifice their health, their social standing, and often their sanity just to survive in a world that offered few alternatives. The brutal truth is that these jobs existed because medieval society needed them done, but couldn't afford to treat the people who did them with basic human dignity. It was a system that created an entire class of social outcasts whose suffering made civilized life possible for everyone else. These professions remind us how much our modern world has changed, not just in terms of technology, but in our basic understanding of human rights, workplace safety, and social responsibility. Every labor law, every workplace protection, every basic standard of human decency we take for granted today was hard-won through centuries of people fighting against systems that treated workers as expendable. Now, if you've made it this far with me through this tour of medieval employment hell, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let us know what corner of the globe you're calling home, because it's amazing to see how these historical horror stories reach people everywhere. And if you're hungry for more stories that will make you grateful for modern civilization while horrifying you about the past, you know what to do. Subscribe to our channel. Trust me, we have historical nightmares that will make you appreciate everything from indoor plumbing to basic human rights. Until next time, remember, the next time you complain about your job, at least you're not a medieval gong farmer.